By the dawning of the Roaring Twenties a century ago, people must have felt like life was starting to be turned upside down. They were living through a period in which horses were fast being replaced by the automobile as the preferred means of travel, in which film projectors were showing moving pictures that were shocking and entertaining the world for the very first time, and in which the radio was revolutionizing the way people were being kept informed and entertained. And while this might have been shocking and worrying to some, others eagerly embraced the changes that were happening around them. And if there was anyone who embodied this enthusiasm for the new technological changes among the people in Marathon County, it would probably be the musician and bandleader named C.S. Cone. Clive Sterling Cone was born and raised in Waterloo, Wisconsin. His considerable musical talent became obvious from an early age, and he spent his teenage years playing in local brass bands. After finishing school, he joined up with a number of traveling theatrical troupes that were touring across the Midwest, both as an actor and a musician. At some point, probably 1895 or so, Cone was working as the music director for one such theater company that happened to end its season in Wausau, Wisconsin. One thing common to most of these theater companies that were active at the time, as well as later, was that they would go through these regular cycles of being formed and disbanded every single year. So what this looked like was that every spring, the company owners or organizers would establish a brand new theater company, and then go through the process of finalizing all the logistics for the tour for that year. And then the company would set out on the tour, doing the run of shows throughout the region, traveling from city to city, playing maybe a show or two or three, maybe for a day or two at each stop. And then, when all of the dates were finished and the tour came to an end in the late fall, the company would usually then disband, rather than having to figure out how to continue during the winter months. But then, in the following spring, the company would get together and be reborn once again as a brand new theater company, and then start the whole yearly process over again. So this sort of model allowed the owners of the company to avoid having to maintain the organization during the winter months in which they weren't making any money by touring. And that's a good thing for them, but the end result of this model often meant that the general members of the company then found themselves stranded in whatever town they were left in at the end of the tour. And this is how C.S. Cone ended up in Wausau in the fall of 1895. And rather than buy a train ticket home to Waterloo, or wherever he was going like the other people of the company, he decided to stick around in Wausau for the winter, and he took a job running Alexander Hall. Alexander Hall was built in 1892, originally as a temporary replacement for the opera house that had burned down the previous year. And while it would be overshadowed in some ways by the construction of new buildings like the Columbia Hall and the Grand Opera House in the next few years, Alexander Hall would continue to be a vital place for community activities over the next 3 decades. And for the moment, it was providing Cone a nice place to make a living in the winter of 1895 and 96. And rather than sign on to another theater company in the following spring, Cone decided to make Marathon County his new home. In addition to running the hall, he also began teaching music lessons to a growing number of students throughout the region. At this point, there weren't that many instrumental musicians left in Wausau. The professional musicians of the region had almost all joined up with Frank Dana's band in the early 1890s, and when Dana decided to move his 3rd Regimental Band out of town in 1894, most of the musicians had gone with him. And so, at least initially, the musical groups that Cone was putting together were smaller ensembles, with the musicians drawn largely from the circle of young students that he was cultivating around himself. But over the next 2 years or so, Cone's bands and small orchestras were clearly improving very quickly, and Cone's place at the center of arts and music in central Wisconsin would be solidified by a series of events that occurred in 1898. The events that prompted Cone to finally put together a full modern brass band all began when the United States went to war with Spain in 1898. So a little context here in case you're not familiar with this story. Towards the end of the 19th century, the United States and the Spanish Empire were coming into conflict over the future of Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish were doing their best to hold on to their colonial holdings in the face of growing demands for national liberation. Meanwhile, the United States was quickly rising among the global powers of the 1800s, and many Americans had come to see themselves as the protector of the New World against the intrigues of the Old. After an American warship sunk while in port off Cuba, American newspapermen quickly blamed the Spanish, and they whipped the public opinion into a frenzy to demand a forceful response. And so, in short order, the United States and Spain were at war over the future of the Spanish colonial holdings. And as the powder keg that was Cuba erupted into a larger war throughout the Western Hemisphere, the Wausau Light Guards, as Company G of the 3rd Regiment of the Wisconsin National Guard, were mobilized, and after reporting for duty, they were mustered into the service of the U.S. Army and ordered south to prepare for the invasion of the Caribbean. Wisconsin's 3rd was tasked with joining the American forces getting ready to take the island of Puerto Rico, along, by the way, with Wisconsin's 2nd Regiment. And Company G would be joined in this endeavor by the musicians of Frank Dana's 3rd Regimental Band, many formerly of Wausau, but by this point the band was headquartered in Marinette. But when the call came to mobilize, not all of Wisconsin's regimental bands would answer, or could answer. In Janesville, the 1st Regimental Band initially had trouble finding enough musicians to pull together a full outfit for the service. Bandmaster John Luders went to work recruiting new musicians and eventually managed to field a proper regimental band that would be sent to a military camp in Florida with the rest of Wisconsin's 1st. But down in Milwaukee, the 4th Regimental Band declined to enter active service altogether. At this point, the 4th Regimental Band was run by Joseph Clowder Sr., who at the time was one of the foremost band leaders and popular composers in the whole of the United States. But he had accepted the position of 4th Regimental Band a few years earlier, mainly because it did not entail all that much extra work. And when faced with the prospect of going to war in the Caribbean, Clowder and his band decided to stay home. The Wisconsin National Guard, then, while it was overseeing the mobilization of the state's soldiers as well as the influx of new men who were volunteering for the conflict, now had to scramble to find a new band for its 4th Regiment. Over the next few months, some 24 cities across Wisconsin submitted their bands for consideration, but Wausau once again got the lucky pull, and C.S. Cone was chosen to head the new band for the 4th Regiment. He was given the rank of chief musician and tasked with recruiting a band for the service by the end of the year. The roster for this new 4th Regimental Band would largely be based around the small group that Cone was putting together in Wausau, but the rest of the chairs were filled with musicians from all across central Wisconsin, from Marshfield to Appleton, Plover to Rhinelander. And so, in late 1898, Cone's newly created 4th Volunteer Regimental Band made the trip down to a military camp formed outside Anniston, Alabama, which would be about as far as the band would get during the course of the war. During the next few months, down in the sunny South, Cone's band marched in a parade or two, they played a few concerts, and were even featured as acts in the Birmingham Carnival. But as far as wars go, the Spanish-American War ended fairly conclusively and fairly quickly. Fighting ceased in April of 1899 after less than a year of hostilities between the two powers. The Wisconsin National Guard decided to muster out many of the Wisconsin men who had volunteered for the course of the conflict. They had been necessary to fill the ranks during the course of the war, but now that they were no longer federalized, Wisconsin really didn't have the means to pay for all of them during peacetime. And actually, it's pretty typical to see the National Guard do some rethinking of the organization of its companies and regiments after a war ends. And this process usually leads to some significant changes for the organization. In the case of Cone and the 4th Regimental Band, the Wisconsin National Guard decided to muster out the entirety of the 4th Regiment. And if there was no 4th Regiment, there was really no need for a 4th Regimental Band. And so, after being released from their military commissions, Cone and his boys came home to Wisconsin. And he decided that he wanted to keep the band up and running as a military-style commercial band running out of Wausau. And the thing about this is, though, while they had been mustered out of the 4th Regiment in 1899, they continued to use the name 4th Regimental Band for the next 2 decades. He and his musicians were explicitly no longer soldiers. They were not involved in the National Guard or any other military organization. But Cone understood the importance of the name nonetheless. Cone's band just didn't have the same ring to it as the 4th Regimental Band, especially as military bands were among the superstars of the American music scene at the turn of the century. And so, the 4th Regiment continued to be the name used by the music groups organized by Cone over the next few decades. Not only his commercial brass band that he brought back from the war, but also for the orchestras that Cone was organizing for other functions. These groups operated out of the newly finished Grand Opera House, which Cone returned home to oversee as one of the major owners of. Cone's tenure as the proprietor of the Grand Opera House, which he was, saw it become one of the most prominent places of entertainment in the region, and it hosted events put on by the people of Wausau that ranged from talent shows to local theater productions, concerts, and even fashion shows. But Cone's slogan for the Grand Opera House was always, "The best is none too good for Wausau." And in addition to hosting local events, he also worked tirelessly to bring in the best entertainment he could find for the venue as well. The Grand Opera House became a favorite spot for touring acts and entertainment of all sorts, ranging from the popular vaudeville shows that were the rage in the 19-teens and 20s, and then even by the 1920s they even hosted boxing events. Cone also was bringing in new technology. He purchased the city's first film projector, and it was a point of pride that he would secure the newest, most popular moving pictures there for the people to enjoy. He also arranged, on occasion, for radio broadcasts of performances from the Grand Opera House, which would go out to the people across the Midwest. Finding the city lacking the means to advertise events and programs in the way that he'd want to, which, by the way, also included the films and events that were featured at his own venues, Cone also established the City Bill Poster Company, which operated for a while in the 19-teens, putting up billboards and posters across the city. And if all that wasn't enough, Cone also became one of Wausau's first automobile dealers. He established an auto dealership in 1909 to sell EMF 30s, and over the next 15 years, the dealership would shift to sell Studebakers and later Chandlers. But as exciting as the 19-teens were, the roaring 20s of the next decade would be a little bit less exciting for C.S. Cone. By the time that World War I was coming to a close in 1919, Cone's 4th Regimental Band had largely stopped performing. The city now had an actual military band, once again, the 10th Infantry and later the 128th Infantry Band. He sold off his automobile dealership in late 1924, and in 1926 he sold his interest in the Grand Opera House, which would be torn down and replaced by the Grand Theater the following year. But by the end of the 1920s, in this period of uncertainty, C.S. Cone would emerge with a new musical role, and he became the traveling professional bandmaster to help establish music in emerging communities across the region. Over the course of the 1930s and 1940s, Cone is credited with leading a bewildering number of groups all across Marathon County and beyond, to the point where it's actually pretty difficult to keep track of them all. He's credited with running at least one juvenile band associated with the church in Wausau, at least for a few years, although which church is a little unclear from the sources, at least from the time of this recording. He also would occasionally put together smaller ensembles that would pop up in Wausau, such as a guitar and mandolin club that might show up for a few months and then disappear. He went to Marshfield to direct the St. John's Church Band, sometimes credited as a juvenile band, but probably a parochial school band, although those were not necessarily mutually exclusive. He also went down to Mosinee in the 1930s, leading an American Legion band there for the Mosinee Post of the American Legion. And then there was a string of community bands that Cone was asked to come in and help lead. Sometimes he got in on the ground floor, sometimes he took over for an existing outfit that had an outgoing leader and an opening. These apparently were from all over central Wisconsin, not just Marathon County, and included cities that ranged from Stratford to Athens, Edgar to Wittenberg, Tomahawk, Merrill, and even down in New Lisbon. These stints as band leader varied in how long he was there. Sometimes he was the institutional band leader for that group for a decade or more, and sometimes he was there for maybe a single season or maybe just a couple concerts. But clearly, Cone was traveling very extensively during this period, as the traveling professor of these community bands. By the time of his death in 1948, one could argue that no other individual had done quite as much to build and sustain the music scene of Marathon County as C.S. Cone. The only other figure that you could say had a similar impact on the music scene here would perhaps be B.F. Schultz, and incidentally we will be talking about him next time. But the career of C.S. Cone was certainly remarkable. He cut his teeth playing in the theater companies that toured across the Midwest. He formed and led a military band during a time of war. He established and ran an opera house that became the center of social life in Wausau. He established community and school bands all across central Wisconsin, and he was a teacher and mentor to generations of new musicians, all the while promoting the newest technologies of the day. Cone had arrived in a community that was largely devoid of instrumental music. And through a life of hard work, in which the best was none too good in his estimation, he elevated the musicality of Marathon County and allowed it to become what it is today.